Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Now, let's float from the individual scriptorium to the bigger picture. Because as charming as a single monk sprinkling sand over wet ink is, the Renaissance was not just about individual acts of patience. It was about networks of letters, books, artists, scientists, and scribes, all quietly dependent on something as humble as sand. Imagine Europe in the 1500s. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris are buzzing with ideas. Not loud buzzing, more like a gentle hum of parchment rustling, quills scratching, and sand shifting in shallow trays. Knowledge is moving, slowly but surely, and every step of the journey relies on the careful drying of ink. Think about it. Before books were mass-produced, ideas traveled by hand. Scholars wrote letters to each other, sometimes across countries. Merchants documented contracts. Artists sent sketches for feedback. Every single one of these movements depended on words not smearing during transit. One poorly dried page, and an entire argument, recipe, or formula could be lost to a smudge. Sand was the silent guardian of European thought. Even in courts, the ritual mattered. A royal decree or treaty required precision. Kings might have fancy inkwells, exotic quills, and imported paper, but none of it mattered if the ink ran. A well-placed shake of sand could preserve dynasties in written form, at least on paper. It's amusing to imagine a monarch's fate quietly tied to a pile of gritty particles. Political history resting on sand. Now, let's gently float over to the world of artists. Leonardo, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, they weren't just painting walls and sketches. They were writing notes, drafting plans, experimenting with techniques, and ink was involved. Sand ensured that the thoughts captured on paper didn't bleed into chaos before they could be translated into masterpieces. Even scientific observation relied on this quiet art. Botanical studies, anatomical sketches, early astronomical charts, all depended on careful writing and drawing. Sand may not have discovered anything, but it helped preserve discoveries. Without it, some of those first sketches of human anatomy might have just smeared away. It's a kind of unsung heroism. No one wrote odes to the sand, yet it underpinned intellectual progress. The Renaissance wasn't only genius and creativity. It was meticulous care, repetition, and patience. Every grain contributed. Every stroke that didn't smear mattered. Let's float now into a small chamber in Venice, where a merchant is writing a shipment list. Perhaps he's sweating over parchment, worried about ink smudging before it can be sent. He sprinkles sand, taps the excess off, and waits. Minutes pass. The ink sets. The letter will reach Florence intact. The shipment will be recorded, the accounts balanced. It's mundane. It's quiet. But without that sand, chaos could reign. And this is the paradox of sand in the Renaissance. It's tiny, inconspicuous, dusty, yet its influence is massive. It touches art, science, commerce, and correspondence alike. Small, almost invisible, yet essential. Meanwhile, scribes were experimenting. Different grains, different textures, sometimes combined with powdered chalk or pumice. Each variation subtly altered how the ink interacted with paper. Smoothness, absorption, drying time, all affected by a pinch of particles. And the results weren't just aesthetic. They determined the legibility, the durability, the very survival of texts. Consider how this plays out centuries later. We can still read letters from the 1500s. We can still admire sketches, plans, and marginalia. Those grains of sand, so mundane at the time, helped preserve centuries of human thought. A quiet act of preservation, almost invisible, almost poetic. The same principles applied in printing houses. Early presses faced the problem of offset, wet ink transferring between sheets. Printers dusted their freshly printed pages with sand to prevent smudging. It was a simple, low-tech solution, but it worked. And in this way, sand helped books spread across Europe, quietly facilitating the intellectual explosion we now call the Renaissance. Even the public, who rarely saw a scribe at work, benefited. Because of sand, letters, manuscripts, and printed books arrived intact. Ideas could be shared, copied, critiqued. The slow drip of ink into permanence, helped along by tiny grains, shaped the way knowledge moved. Now, imagine the irony. Renaissance Europe, an age of genius and flamboyant artistry, relied heavily on something as banal as sand. No one celebrated it. It didn't get credit in treatises or paintings. Yet without it, countless ideas might have been lost. Dynasties, discoveries, works of art, all preserved by granular patience. And perhaps that's the quiet charm of history. The small, unnoticed details often matter the most. While we admire grand architecture, dazzling paintings, and brilliant scholars, it's easy to forget the gritty, mundane acts. The sprinkling of sand over wet ink, the careful tap of a quill, the slow drying that preserved thought for centuries. Sand, in a way, was democracy for permanence. Everyone needed it: monks, merchants, nobles, artists, printers. It didn't matter your social class, your skill, or your wealth. The ink had to dry, and sand was the silent enforcer. Let's drift gently toward the personal side. A scholar writing a philosophical treatise late at night, a candle guttering, the wind tugging at the shutters. He sprinkles sand over his finished lines, leans back, and exhales. He doesn't know if anyone will read his work. Maybe it will sit in a library, untouched for decades. But the words are safe. The ink is dry. Sand has done its work. It's a quiet, almost meditative moment. The Renaissance is often portrayed as loud and brilliant, but here, in these small, dusty rituals, we see the patient heartbeat of the era. Sand, ink, quill, parchment, simple, quiet, profound. Even correspondence between monarchs or scholars carried the same ritual. A letter might cross hundreds of miles, transported by courier, all the while depending on sand to ensure it arrived legible. Diplomacy, trade, science, and art, all subtly bound to this granular, silent helper. Now, having wandered through scriptoriums, workshops, and printing houses, let's think about the ripple effect of all this careful, dusty patience. Because sand wasn't just about keeping ink in place. It subtly influenced the very shape of the Renaissance mind. Consider handwriting. Today, we type everything, and every letter is uniform, predictable, emotionless. Back then, letters were shaped by the physical act of writing and drying. A quill loaded with wet iron gall ink moves differently depending on how quickly the ink dries. The coarseness of the paper, and yes, the sand sprinkled over it. Too much sand, and the ink might dull, leaving pale lines that a scribe would press harder to compensate. Too little, and it could sneer, forcing careful spacing or slower writing. Over time, these small adjustments shaped handwriting styles. Certain loops, swirls, and flourishes became common, in part because of how ink interacted with paper and sand. It's a subtle, almost invisible form of influence. A mundane drying technique helping define the aesthetic of an era. The very look of Renaissance manuscripts, neat, precise, sometimes almost delicate, owes a quiet debt to granular patience. Then there's manuscript decoration. Illuminators, the artists who added intricate borders, gold leaf, and tiny illustrations, depended on ink drying properly before they could paint nearby. Sand enabled layers of detail to coexist without smudging. One tiny smudge could ruin hours of painstaking gilding. So the art we admire today, those colorful, delicate borders, the tiny painted figures dancing in margins, partially exists because someone sprinkled sand over wet ink and waited. It's a reminder that beauty often relies on very ordinary, unseen acts of care. Even in scientific illustration, sand mattered. Astronomers, anatomists, botanists, their diagrams needed clarity. A smudged sketch of a plant or a heart could lead to misinterpretation. Careful drying ensured accuracy. So, in a strange, indirect way, sand helped preserve knowledge. It literally kept lines from bleeding, preserving the precision necessary for study, replication, and teaching. You might say that Renaissance knowledge wasn't just built on genius. It was built on grains. Tiny, silent, indispensable grains. And there's a social dimension, too. Letters and manuscripts were status symbols. The quality of your ink, the smoothness of your paper, the neatness of your script, all signals of refinement. Sand played a role in that. A well-dried page looked professional, elegant, disciplined. A smudged page suggested carelessness. In some cases, even wealth couldn't save a poorly dried manuscript. Thus, sand enforced a subtle social hierarchy, a quiet arbiter of respectability. The right sprinkle could elevate a clerk to an footing with his patron, at least visually. It's amusing, in a very dry way, that social perception hinged partially on something as mundane as the distribution of grains. Think of the broader cultural networks, too. Scholars exchanged letters across Europe, often carrying delicate ideas about philosophy, science, and politics. Wet ink could ruin months of thought. Sand ensured legibility, continuity, and preservation. It made intellectual collaboration possible. Without it, some early scientific experiments might have been lost. Some political correspondence misread, some artistic sketches ruined. The quiet act of letting ink dry, assisted by humble sand, underpinned the spread of ideas. It's fascinating to imagine the unseen influence of these tiny particles. No one wrote a history of sand, yet here we are, centuries later, benefiting from its uncelebrated labor. Let's drift now into the sensory world of these scribes. Picture a scholar leaning over his desk, candle flickering. The scent of ink is strong, slightly acidic. The table is rough wood, grooves from decades of use. He shakes sand lightly over his page. The grains scatter, settling into the texture of the paper. He tilts the sheet, brushes off the excess. The ink has dried. The words are permanent. He exhales. Maybe he smiles. Maybe he sighs. But that moment, small, almost invisible, utterly necessary, is the quiet heartbeat of the Renaissance. It's a ritual repeated thousands of times by thousands of hands, across centuries. And then there's the matter of accidents. Sand sometimes got in the wrong places. Excess grains could stick to wet ink, leaving faint speckles. Over time, some manuscripts appeared dotted with tiny stars, remnants of ancient drying rituals. These accidental traces give modern historians a tactile connection to the past. They are the fingerprints of patience. Even printers, trying to speed up production, had to respect drying times. Sand prevented pages from sticking together. In a way, it was a buffer against haste, a reminder that rushing could destroy your work. Perhaps that's why the Renaissance, despite its intense creativity, moved deliberately. Every letter, every page, every work of art respected the time it needed to exist. Now, as Europe transitioned toward the late Renaissance, new tools appeared: blotting paper, better inks, smoother papers. Sand began to fade from common use, yet the influence lingered. The lessons of patience, attention to detail, and the small rituals that preserved thought were already embedded in intellectual culture, even today. In calligraphy or manuscript restoration, sand's quiet legacy persists. Modern practitioners may not sprinkle grains, but they follow the same principle: respect the ink, respect the page, respect the process. So, to some, this drifting meditation without breaking the rhythm. Sand may have been humble, overlooked, dusty, and ordinary, yet it enabled permanence. It shaped handwriting, it influenced art, it preserved science, it ensured correspondence. It quietly connected monks, merchants, nobles, and artists across centuries. The Renaissance might have been dazzling in marble and paint, but the invisible grains on parchment were equally essential. Without them, words would smear, sketches would blur, and ideas might vanish. Sand, in its subtle, unassuming way, helped shape the age. And as we close this portion of reflection, imagine the tiny ritual one last time: quill dipped, ink flowing, sand shaken over wet lines, excess brushed off, a deep, deliberate pause. A moment of mindfulness embedded in everyday life, centuries before anyone invented mindfulness apps. Let's take a soft turn from tools and manuscripts to the people themselves. Because all the sand in the world doesn't matter if there isn't a hand to sprinkle it, a mind to wield a quill, and eyes patient enough to wait. Imagine a Renaissance scholar sitting at his wooden desk in a quiet study. Candlelight flickers against the wall, illuminating the faint curls of smoke from incense. He's been writing for hours: letters, treatises, notes on philosophy, maybe some doodles along the margins. Every page is wet with ink, waiting, fragile, vulnerable. And there, beside him, is the sand. It's an intimate ritual, not glamorous, not heroic, but essential. He dips the quill one last time, lays down the final words, and sprinkles sand in a slow, deliberate motion. Tap, tilt, brush. The words are safe. A small sigh of relief. Maybe he mutters under his breath, finally. Or maybe he just leans back and listens to the faint hiss of the grains settling. Patience was an unspoken virtue of the time. In an age without instant messaging or word processors, waiting was built into daily life. And waiting taught lessons. A smudged letter could damage reputation, ruin contracts, or confuse a colleague. Every grain of sand was a small teacher. Take your time. Be careful. Respect your work. Monks, artists, merchants, and scholars all shared this tiny but profound discipline. The act of sprinkling sand, watching the ink dry, and gently brushing it away is a form of mindfulness centuries before anyone called it that. It's mundane, slow, and unremarkable, yet it shapes character, precision, and diligence down. Let's imagine a young apprentice, new to the scriptorium. His quill is awkward, his hand unsteady. Ink blots form on the page almost immediately. He's told to sprinkle sand, but not too much, not too little, and to brush carefully without smudging the lines. Each mistake becomes a lesson in subtlety, a gentle push toward mastery. There's a quiet irony here. The same grains that preserved wisdom also taught it. Sand was both protector and teacher. It demanded attention. It rewarded care, and it punished sloppiness. Then, of course, there were the wealthy nobles, dabbling in writing for leisure. Their letters, often perfumed and neatly folded, depended on sand as much as any scholar's manuscript. But their relationship with it was different. They were aware of aesthetics, presentation, status. Sand wasn't just functional. It was part of the image, the appearance of refinement and control. A poorly dried letter could embarrass a courtier just as easily as a monk dot, in fact. Some nobles turned the ritual of drying into performance. Tiny silver pounce pots, engraved and polished, were tapped rhythmically beside inkwells. The act of sprinkling sand became a display of elegance, a quiet declaration. Look, I take care with my words. Artists, meanwhile, faced an additional challenge. They often worked with mixed media, ink, watercolor, and sometimes gold leaf. Each layer required careful drying. Sand wasn't just a tool. It was part of their workflow, part of the choreography of creation. A misstep, a rush, or an impatient flick of the hand could ruin hours of work. Even the great Leonardo da Vinci likely spent countless minutes sprinkling sand over pages of sketches, quietly ensuring that his observations of anatomy or engineering remained intact. For someone capable of designing flying machines, the task of waiting for ink to dry must have been maddeningly slow, and yet necessary. Beyond patience, there's another human element: sensory engagement. The feel of fine grains between fingers, the gentle hiss as they land on wet ink, the soft scrape when brushing off excess, the faint smell of iron gall ink mingling with the dust. It's intimate, tactile, grounding. Writing was an experience, not just a task. And sand was at the center of it. Even modern readers can sense it. Hold a Renaissance manuscript in your hands. Trace the letters. Observe the tiny indentations, the faint speckles where sand once rested. You're touching not just words, but centuries of human care, attention, and habit. It's a physical connection to people long gone, quietly preserved in paper, ink, and dust. There's also an emotional side. Writing in the Renaissance was never completely private, yet it carried weight. Letters to lovers, instructions to apprentices, notes to patrons, all required clarity and permanence. Wet ink was fragile. Sand, tiny as it was, offered assurance. It was a small comfort in an unpredictable world, and mistakes mattered. A smear could offend a patron, mislead a scholar, or confuse a trader. Every sprinkle of sand reduced that risk. It's funny, in a dry way, that so much of human emotion and consequence relied on the proper handling of grains of earth. Even children training to write had to learn these rituals. Nobility or wealthy merchants often sent children to tutors. Their education included not only forming letters, but learning how to care for their work. Sprinkle sand, wait, brush gently. Over time, these small acts instilled patience, precision, and respect for permanence, traits that would carry into adulthood, into leadership, artistry, and scholarship. So, in a sense, sand shaped not just manuscripts, but people. The subtle guidance of tiny grains of dust influenced habits, attention, and skill development across generations. And of course, there were accidents, comedies, and small frustrations. Spilled sand, stuck grains, smudges that slipped through anyway. Some scribes got creative. They would shake sand over a page and then tilt it carefully to direct it exactly where it was needed. Others would simply sigh and start the line over. These small challenges taught flexibility, resilience, and problems, quietly shaping human behavior in the process. Even the impatient or careless learned something over time. Slow down. Respect your materials. Respect the process. The act of writing and drying became a meditation in itself. Let's gently float over to the workshops of artists and illustrators. Sand wasn't only about drying ink. It became an integral part of the workflow, influencing timing, composition, and even creativity itself. Think about it. Each stroke of ink, each painted flourish, had to be considered in relation to drying. An impatient hand could ruin hours of delicate work. Some illuminators developed subtle strategies. They would sprinkle sand on a line of ink, let it settle, then work on a different section while waiting. This led to a kind of choreographed workflow, alternating between ink, sand, brush, and detail. Over time, this careful pacing shaped not just the manuscripts, but the artist's approach to work in general. A slow, measured rhythm, and there's a quiet artistry in that rhythm. Even the placement of sand mattered. Too much in one spot could dull the richness of the ink. Too little, and the line might smear. Artists and scribes learned to read their sand, how it landed, how it interacted with the page, how to use it to anticipate the movement of ink. The effect extended to writing style as well. Flourishes, loops, and decorative swirls weren't just aesthetic choices. Sometimes they were practical. A scribe might space letters or adjust line thickness to allow sufficient drying time. Over decades, these small practical adaptations influenced the visual style of handwriting across Europe. So, in a quiet, almost invisible way, sand shaped the look of Renaissance manuscripts. Those elegant, precise forms we admire today weren't only artistic, they were also the product of centuries of careful, patient ink drying. A little grain of earth guiding the hand of history. Now, let's float to the social dimension again. Correspondence, letters, and documents were tools of connection and influence. A letter arriving smeared or unreadable could embarrass a noble, frustrate a merchant, or confuse a scholar. Sand ensured clarity, even in the mundane. Some courtiers and clerks became almost obsessive about it. They would shake sand lightly over each page, tap it to settle, tilt the sheet, and brush off excess. The repetitive motions were almost meditative, and over time, these rituals became ingrained habits. Precision and patience weren't just learned. They were lived daily. Even in domestic settings, writing at home required the same attention. Wealthy households often kept sandpots on desks, even if writing was occasional. A letter to a distant relative or a business note could never be rushed. Sand was a silent enforcer of care. Interestingly, this small act, sprinkling and brushing sand, also influenced time perception. Writing was slow, deliberate. Waiting for ink to dry forced mindfulness. You couldn't hurry. The work unfolded in its own rhythm. a quiet, controlled pacing that shaped thought and attention. And humor wasn't absent, though subtle. Scribes and clerks sometimes lamented over stubborn ink. "Why won't you dry?" they might mutter. Sand could only do so much. There were stories of mischievous apprentices shaking sand in the wrong spot, creating tiny constellations of accidental dots across a page. Sometimes, a page had more sand than ink, and the resulting texture resembled something between a star map and a blotting disaster. These small imperfections, however, didn't ruin work entirely. They became part of the manuscript's character, a subtle reminder that even in a disciplined environment, human error and chance left their mark. Let's not forget the role of sand in early printing. Printers faced similar challenges with wet ink on sheets of paper. Sand helped prevent pages from sticking together, smudging, or offsetting. The meticulous use of sand in scriptoriums directly influenced the practices of early presses. Techniques developed for individual manuscripts carried over to mass production, affecting how books were produced, handled, and preserved. It's quietly remarkable. Sand, a simple, humble material, shaped the habits of scholars, artists, merchants, and printers alike. It influenced handwriting, aesthetics, workflow, social conduct, and even the emergence of print culture. And finally, there's the emotional and psychological impact. Waiting for ink to dry, sprinkling sand, brushing it off. These were acts of care, patience, and respect. They shaped people's relationships with their work, with knowledge, and with communication. The ritual reinforced the value of deliberate, mindful effort. In a sense, sand taught Renaissance Europe to slow down, to observe, to respect permanence. Not in grand speeches or political decrees, but in small, repetitive gestures. Every page, every letter, every sketch bore witness to this quiet discipline. By the late Renaissance, the world of writing was subtly shifting. Paper was smoother, inks were more refined, and the spread of printed books introduced new demands on speed and efficiency. Yet the humble sandpot still lingered on desks, quietly asserting its relevance. Printers, for example, faced challenges similar to scribes. Wet ink on freshly printed sheets could smudge, ruining multiple copies at once. Sand, sprinkled lightly, prevented offset and kept text legible during stacking and storage. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. In some ways, sand was one of the first quality control tools in early publishing. Uncelebrated, unbranded, but vital dot. And then there was blotting paper. Introduced gradually in the 16th century, it promised to absorb excess ink more efficiently than sand. Some scribes embraced it immediately. Others resisted. Old habits die slowly, and sand had its fans. Some argued that blotting paper dulled the vibrancy of ink, or that it lacked the tactile satisfaction of sprinkling and brushing grains by hand. The debate was subtle, quiet, almost imperceptible, but it mattered. Scribes, who preferred sand, maintained control over drying, texture, and timing. Blotting paper offered speed, but less ceremony. The choice reflected more than efficiency. It reflected values, patience versus haste, tactile ritual versus convenience, tradition versus innovation. Even in domestic writing, these small decisions shaped behavior. Wealthy families might adopt blotting paper for everyday letters while keeping sand for formal correspondence. Artists, scholars, and clerks sometimes used both, depending on the medium or the importance of the document. Each choice subtly influenced the final work, the sharpness of lines, the depth of color. the permanence of thought. And of course, mistakes persisted. Sand could cling stubbornly to textured paper, leaving tiny, unintended dots. Blotting paper could tear or warp delicate sheets. Each tool had strengths and weaknesses, and their use required judgment, experience, and attention, all traits nurtured by the slow, careful rhythms of Renaissance work. Now, let's gently float to the broader cultural impact, the transition from sand to blotting paper mirrors, a larger shift in Renaissance life, the balance between tradition and progress. The era was about curiosity, innovation, and discovery, yet deeply rooted in centuries-old habits and rituals. Sand, unremarkable and dusty, became a symbol of continuity. It reminded people that progress could be tempered by patience, that even genius required respect for the material world. In a way, the decline of sand is almost poetic. As technology advanced, rituals changed, but the values it embodied, care, patience, mindfulness, persisted in subtle ways. Even the use of blotting paper carried forward the same lessons, just in a slightly different form. Let's drift now into the artistic realm. Illuminated manuscripts and early printed books began to show traces of evolving practices. Some pages retain faint grains embedded in ink, a vestige of older habits. Others are perfectly smooth, blot-free, reflecting newer techniques. Scholars and restorers can still detect the tiny footprints of sand in centuries-old texts. It's almost like archaeology. Each grain tells a story, a moment in the quiet, deliberate process of preservation. The transition also influenced style. With more predictable drying, scribes could experiment with more intricate flourishes and decorations. Letters became slightly more daring, borders more elaborate, miniature illustrations more detailed. Sand, in retreat, had already laid the groundwork for this evolution by teaching control, precision, and patience. Even in correspondence, the shift mattered. Faster drying methods allowed for quicker exchanges of letters. Ideas traveled more rapidly. Merchants conducted business more efficiently. Scholars shared observations without the slow pauses once required by sand. The world was still deliberate by our standards, but a small, invisible acceleration was underway. And yet, the human habits cultivated by centuries of sand use didn't vanish overnight. Care, attention, ritual, these persisted in the behavior of scribes, clerks, and artists. Sand may have faded, but its influence remained embedded in the very culture of writing. Now, consider the symbolic side. Sand had always represented impermanence, the passage of time. Sprinkled over wet ink, it transformed fleeting fluid into enduring mark. Even as blotting paper emerged, that symbolism lingered. Writers, consciously or not, retained the mental ritual of allowing thought to settle, of respecting time. It's a quiet meditation embedded in ordinary acts. And there's a subtle irony here. The Renaissance celebrated human achievement, innovation, and rapid intellectual growth. Yet much of that progress relied on waiting. Sand taught waiting. It imposed pause. It reminded people that permanence and care were inseparable. Finally, let's reflect on the broader historical perspective. Today, we think of sand as mundane, even trivial. Yet, in the Renaissance, it shaped the way people worked, learned, and communicated. It influenced handwriting, artistic style, scientific accuracy, and the very rhythm of intellectual life. Tiny grains guided the hand, the eye, and the mind. Without them, letters might smear, sketches blur, and knowledge could be lost. It's humbling. The smallest, most overlooked details often carry the greatest weight. In a world of grand inventions, political upheavals, and brilliant geniuses, it was the silent, dusty, patient grains of sand that quietly held everything together. Now, let's glide gently from manuscripts and printing presses to the classrooms and studies of the Renaissance. Sand's quiet influence extended far beyond the page. It shaped habits, discipline, and even the way people thought. Education in the Renaissance was rigorous, precise, and often painfully slow. Students learned not just letters and numbers, but patience, meticulousness, and attentiveness to detail. And yes, sand played a role. Every young scribe or scholar was taught to respect ink, to sprinkle carefully, to wait for it to dry. These small acts weren't merely practical, they trained the mind. Imagine a student learning Latin, copying texts word by word. Ink flows onto the page. Sand is sprinkled. Excess is brushed away. A smudge here or there could mean starting over. Over time, these repetitive, deliberate rituals instilled habits, concentration, precision, patience. The discipline of the hand shaped the discipline of thought. Correspondence etiquette also intertwined with these habits. Letters weren't casual. They were statements of education, status, and respect. A smudged, carelessly dried letter could offend a noble, frustrate a patron, or diminish the sender's credibility. Sand ensured that words arrived intact, and in doing so, reinforced the social expectation of careful attention. It's interesting to consider the same grains of sand that prevented smears also reinforced social norms. Slow, deliberate writing became a marker of refinement. Young learners internalized this lesson. Quality and patience mattered. Even personality and reputation were subtly shaped by the proper handling of ink. Let's drift into the artistic studies again. Aspiring painters, illuminators, and calligraphers trained under masters who emphasized control. Sand wasn't just practical, it was pedagogical. By managing drying time, students learned rhythm, timing, and precision. Over decades, these small lessons influenced entire generations of artists and scribes. There's also a curious psychological effect. Repetitive, meticulous tasks, sprinkling sand, brushing off excess, waiting for ink to dry, reinforced focus and patience. The mind became attuned to subtle cause and effect. Too little sand, ink smears. Too much, lines are dulled. Mistakes were immediate and visible. Learning occurred through tactile visual feedback. It's almost meditative. Students learned discipline without being lectured. The process itself taught attention to detail, respect for permanence, and the quiet satisfaction of doing something well. Even in everyday life, these habits persisted. Adults who had learned careful writing as children carried the lessons forward. Merchants recorded transactions neatly. Scholars documented observations meticulously. Artists approached their work with measured precision. Small, unassuming grains of sand had shaped mindsets, influencing cognition, behavior, and standards of excellence across society. And yes, there were frustrations. An impatient student might knock over a sand pot, sending tiny grains scattering across the floor. A smudge here or there could ruin an entire exercise. Yet these minor setbacks reinforced learning. Mistakes taught care, patience, and resilience. Sand, in its quiet, dusty way, was both teacher and examiner. The ritual of ink drying also encouraged reflection. While waiting for a line to set, A scholar might pause, think, or revise mentally. Perhaps they reconsidered phrasing, pondered ideas, or sketched a margin note. These pauses shaped intellectual processes, embedding deliberation into daily practice. In other words, sand indirectly influenced thinking. By enforcing pauses, it created moments for contemplation, critical assessment, and revision. A simple granular layer became a subtle cognitive tool. Even correspondence across distances was shaped by these habits. Letters sent to faraway friends, colleagues, or patrons had to be carefully prepared. Every word, every line had to survive transit. Sand ensured permanence, yes, but it also subtly reinforced careful planning. Writers thought through phrasing, order, and clarity, knowing that mistakes were costly. It's easy to underestimate this effect. Sand seems mundane, even trivial, yet the ripple of its influence extended from the physical page to social behavior, intellectual habits, and educational practices. Now, let's float over to private study. Imagine a scholar alone in a chamber, quill in hand, ink wet, sand sprinkled, a candle guttering, a moment of stillness, waiting, observing, thinking. This quiet, deliberate pause shaped not just the text, but the scholar's mental discipline. Repetition, patience, and attention became second nature. Over decades, these habits persisted, spreading through communities of scribes, artists, and scholars. Sand, in its silent, uncelebrated way, became a medium through which cultural values were transmitted: care, patience, precision, and respect for permanence. And yet, for all its importance, sand remained invisible. No one wrote treatises on sand itself. No painter signed it alongside their work. No scholar dedicated a paragraph to its influence. Its contribution was quiet, almost imperceptible, but pervasive. It's a reminder that history is often shaped not just by grand events or brilliant geniuses, but by tiny, overlooked details, daily rituals, mundane tools, and the repetitive discipline of countless individuals. A simple handful of grains could ripple through generations, influencing handwriting, art, scholarship, and social behavior. By the late Renaissance and early modern period, the world of writing was gradually changing. Paper became smoother, inks more refined, and new tools like blotting paper and faster-drying inks began to emerge. The humble sandpot, once essential, was slowly becoming a relic of a bygone ritual. Yet, its decline wasn't sudden. Old habits die slowly. Scribes, scholars, and artists had spent decades, sometimes a lifetime, learning precision, patience, and rhythm through the ritual of sprinkling sand. Even when new tools offered convenience, the tactile satisfaction of grains sifting over wet ink had a lingering influence. Many continued to use sand for important documents, ceremonial letters, or manuscripts intended to endure. Printers, too, had to adapt. Early presses faced the problem of offsetting ink when sheets were stacked too soon. Sand helped prevent smudges and ensured legibility. As presses improved and inks dried faster, sand became less necessary, but its use persisted in careful additions. There's a quiet irony here. An innovation designed to speed up production coexisted for decades with a dusty, patient ritual that demanded waiting. Efficiency and mindfulness, side by side. Even artists felt the shift. Illuminators who had relied on sand to protect wet ink now experimented with new drying techniques. Sometimes they used air currents, sometimes blotting paper, or a combination of both. The slow, deliberate pace imposed by sand gradually gave way to slightly quicker work. Yet the lessons remained. Control, precision, and attention to the medium were ingrained habits, passed down through centuries of ritual. Sand's influence persisted subtly in style, flourishes, delicate loops, and ornamentation in handwriting and illustration were shaped not just by taste, but by centuries of practice conditioned by drying times. Even as sand faded, the aesthetics it helped cultivate survived. A quill that once waited patiently for grains to settle could now flow with slightly more freedom. But the underlying discipline remained. In education, the transition was gradual as well. Young scholars learned about blotting, faster inks, and smooth paper. They marveled at these tools, but older mentors often insisted on demonstrating sand first. Tradition and innovation existed in tension. The lesson was not just about tools, but about patience, care, and respect for permanence. There's also a social element. Correspondence etiquette evolved alongside tools. Letters could now be sent more quickly, inks were less prone to smearing, and even ordinary notes could travel longer distances without special precautions. Yet, important letters, diplomatic, scholarly, ceremonial, often retained sand rituals. The deliberate act of sprinkling grains over ink became a subtle marker of status, attention, and refinement. Even domestically, sand lingered. Wealthy households kept small pots on desks, alongside ink, quills, and rulers. Letters sent to relatives, patrons, or business partners often still bore the faint marks of sand-dusted ink. It was partly tradition, partly aesthetics, and partly assurance that words would endure. The psychological and emotional effects persisted. Waiting for ink to dry remained a moment of reflection. Writers paused, observed, and considered their next words. Even with faster tools, the legacy of deliberate pacing shaped thought, encouraging reflection, revision, and mindfulness. And of course, accidents continued. Spilled sand, stubborn grains, uneven coverage. These small challenges taught flexibility, problem-solving, and patience. Mistakes were instructive, reinforcing the discipline embedded in centuries of practice. Even as the material faded from daily necessity, its lessons endured. By the early 17th century, sand was increasingly symbolic rather than essential. Blotting paper and improved inks allowed quicker work, but the cultural and educational imprint of sand remained. Artists, scribes, and scholars still valued careful practice, attention to detail, and the quiet discipline of slow, deliberate effort. Sand had shaped not just manuscripts, but the mindset of an era. Even today, the legacy survives. Modern calligraphers, manuscript restorers, and historical enthusiasts occasionally use sand in demonstrations. They honor the tactile, meditative rituals that defined Renaissance writing. Those grains, seemingly trivial, connect us to centuries of careful thought, meticulous practice, and patient craftsmanship. Now, let's float gently into the interplay between sand, artistry, and early science. Because while sand might seem mundane, it quietly preserved knowledge, influenced creativity, and shaped how people approached observation and documentation. Picture an artist in someone like Andreas Vesalius, carefully sketching the human body. Ink flows from the quill onto the paper, capturing muscles, bones, and intricate details. One stray smear could blur lines, distort proportions, and render a study useless. Sand, sprinkled delicately, ensured each stroke set in place. It's a small, quiet heroism, Sand doesn't get remembered in textbooks, but without it, some of these early scientific illustrations might have been lost to the ages. Each grain, each pause, allowed knowledge to endure. The effect on artistry is equally subtle. Illuminated manuscripts, botanical studies, astronomical charts, all relied on careful drying of ink before additional layers could be added. Gold leaf, watercolor washes, or detailed marginalia could not be applied without patience. Sand provided the necessary pause, a silent assurance that one layer would not ruin another dot. Think about it. Without sand, many Renaissance pages would blur into chaos. Colors would run, lines would smudge, and intricate designs would lose definition. The aesthetic we now admire, precise, deliberate, layered, owes a quiet debt to dusty grains scattered centuries ago. Even in observation, sand played a role. Scholars studying plants, animals, or celestial phenomena relied on detailed notes. Misplaced or smudged ink could alter data, mislead conclusions, or confuse students. Sand ensured permanence. It allowed observation to be recorded accurately, preserved across time and space. It's almost poetic. The tiniest particles preserving humanity's first, careful attempts to understand the world. The meticulous documentation of Renaissance science depended not just on intellect, but on patience and tactile ritual. Artists and scientists alike developed workflows around drying time. They would alternate between sketching, annotating, and adding decorative or technical details while waiting for ink to set. The ritual of sprinkling sand encouraged rhythm, reflection, and deliberate pacing. Over years, these habits influenced the very approach to study and creation. It's fascinating, in a quiet way, that a small granular material could shape methods, habits, and intellectual culture. Sand, invisible to the casual observer, guided hand and mind alike. Consider the social dimension again. Scholars, merchants, and nobility all observed proper handling of ink as part of etiquette. A carefully sanded letter suggested diligence, respect, and education. A smudged one implied haste or carelessness. Sand wasn't just functional. It was a marker of refinement and credibility. This subtle social influence reinforced careful documentation. People wrote more deliberately, revised with more attention, and approached observation and study with mindfulness. Knowledge was protected not only by intellect, but by ritual. Even minor accidents left traces for future generations. Tiny grains embedded in old manuscripts, faint speckles on botanical sketches, or marginal blotches reveal the practical realities of Renaissance work. These traces provide modern historians with insight into workflow, material culture, and daily practice. Sand, in its invisibility, left a tactile signature on history. It's remarkable to reflect that the tiniest particles of the earth helped safeguard knowledge that would otherwise have been fleeting. The durability of Renaissance manuscripts owes as much to careful sprinkling of sand as to genius and creativity. Now, let's drift into the interplay between art and science. Botanical sketches, anatomical drawings, and astronomical charts all benefited from careful ink drying. Each line needed permanence. Each observation demanded clarity. Sand offered that assurance. Without it, detailed observations could blur. Lines could merge, small notations could disappear. A tiny mistake in an anatomical sketch might mislead a student. Sand ensured fidelity, preserving knowledge for posterity. The legacy extends even further. Artists and scholars trained with sand-influenced routines carried lessons forward. Patience, careful planning, and respect for materials became embedded in teaching methods. Young apprentices absorbed not just technical skills, but cognitive habits, reflection, meticulous observation, and measured pacing, its quiet, invisible influence. A small handful of grains shaping methods of thought, artistry, and science across generations. And yet, by the late 17th century, sand's practical use was waning. Faster inks, smoother papers, and widespread adoption of blotting paper replaced most sprinkling rituals. But the habits and aesthetics cultivated by centuries of sand use persisted. The slow, deliberate pace of creation remained, even as tools changed. In essence, sand's influence had already become cultural, cognitive, and artistic. It shaped the way people approached work, learning, and observation, quietly, invisibly. But profoundly, beyond practical preservation, sand had a surprisingly philosophical influence. Renaissance scholars often reflected on permanence and transience. A freshly written line, still wet, could disappear with a careless brush of the hand. Sprinkling sand became a physical acknowledgement of temporality, a conscious pause to respect the moment. It's almost poetic, a grain of earth ensuring that fleeting thought could endure on paper. In the workshops of artists and scribes, this awareness subtly shaped work habits. Every stroke, every annotation, every marginal note was made with heightened attention. The act of waiting, enforced by sand, encouraged reflection. Some scholars wrote drafts in the margins, tested ideas, or adjusted diagrams while waiting for the ink to dry. These micropauses were formative, reinforcing careful thinking. The impact extended to collaboration as well. Correspondence among scholars, artists, and merchants often involved sharing sketches, data, or instructions. A smeared letter could confuse or mislead, sometimes disastrously. Sand mitigated that risk, providing clarity across distance. In a sense, these tiny grains became an invisible connective tissue in the networks of Renaissance knowledge. Even in scientific observation, sand's influence was apparent. Botanical sketches, anatomical studies, and early astronomical charts demanded precision. Mistakes could distort understanding. Each sprinkled grain ensured that observations remained intact and replicable. In a period where empirical methods were emerging, sand contributed quietly to accuracy and reliability. There's also an aesthetic dimension. Many manuscripts and sketches display faint, accidental speckles, traces of sand that fell in unintended places. Modern historians and collectors find these imperfections charming, almost like fingerprints from the past. They are reminders of the human hand behind every creation, the deliberate pause that allowed lines to hold, colors to dry, and ideas to endure. The rhythm of work, too, was shaped by sand. Artists and scribes developed workflows around drying times. While waiting for ink to set, they could plan the next line, consider a composition, or revise a diagram. These small moments structured the day, embedding reflection and deliberate pacing into creative and scholarly practice, even in domestic and courtly correspondence. Sand influenced perception. A well-dried letter conveyed diligence, care, and refinement. Smudged lines, by contrast, suggested haste or negligence. Social expectations intertwined with practical necessity. Sand, invisible as it was, mediated perception, etiquette, and judgment, its amusing in a dry way. The reputation of a noble scholar or merchant could hinge partly on a handful of grains sprinkled over wet ink. Small details carried weight in Renaissance life, shaping behavior, habits, and even social standing. Moreover, sand shaped cognitive habits. Repetitive, precise actions, sprinkling, tapping, brushing, reinforced attention to detail, patience, and mental discipline. Apprentices internalized these lessons early. They learned not only how to handle materials, but how to approach problems thoughtfully and deliberately. These habits persisted into adulthood, influencing professional conduct, artistic creation, and scholarly rigor. In this sense, sand was both material and pedagogy, a tiny, uncelebrated teacher embedded in daily life. Even as technological innovations reduced reliance on sand, its lessons endured. Blotting paper, faster drying inks, and smoother papers replaced much of the practical function, but not the habits. Artists and scholars retained the discipline, reflection, and mindfulness cultivated by centuries of careful practice. The ripple effect is subtle, almost invisible. Sand-shaped handwriting, aesthetics, workflow, pedagogy, scientific accuracy, and social perception. It was never celebrated, yet its influence permeated Renaissance culture. And finally, consider the symbolic resonance. Sand, in its quiet service, reminds us of the delicate balance between speed and care, between innovation and patience. It embodies the principle that permanence is achieved not through haste, but through mindful attention. A handwritten line, protected by grains of dust, becomes a metaphor for thoughtful creation and enduring knowledge. As we pause here, imagine a scholar or artist in a candlelit room. Ink glistens on the page. Sand is sprinkled, excess brushed away. A moment of calm reflection, knowledge preserved, artistry guided, habits shaped, all by tiny, silent particles of earth. As we approach the final reflections on sand in Renaissance writing, it's worth noting that although its practical use waned, its influence lingered, quietly, subtly, almost invisibly. By the 17th century, blotting papers and improved inks had largely replaced sand. Faster drying materials and smoother papers made the ritual less necessary. Yet, the lessons and habits cultivated by centuries of sprinkling, brushing, and waiting endured. Even in modern calligraphy and manuscript restoration, traces of sand's influence are evident. Artists still approach the page with mindfulness, pacing their work and considering how ink behaves on the surface. The rhythm of sprinkling and brushing may have vanished, but the cultivated patience, attention to detail, and deliberate methodology remains central. Sand also shaped cultural appreciation of manuscripts. Scholars, historians, and collectors today notice the faint granular marks on ancient pages. These tiny remnants serve as a tactile connection to the past, revealing workflow, process, and care. A single grain, preserved over centuries, becomes a bridge to the human hand and mind behind the work. It's almost poetic, a substance so humble, so dusty and so mundane, shaping aesthetic choices, intellectual discipline, and cultural memory. Without sand, many manuscripts might have smudged, illustrations blurred, and letters faded. Knowledge, preserved through centuries, owes a quiet debt to these invisible particles. There's also an emotional resonance. Watching a skilled calligrapher work, sprinkling sand or simulating its effect, invites reflection. The slow pace, the tactile engagement, the deliberate care in forming each line, all echo centuries of ritual and discipline. Sand taught humans to value patience, to respect permanence, and to find satisfaction in meticulous effort. even when sand was abandoned for more efficient tools. The mental and cultural habits it fostered persisted. Scribes, artists, scholars, and students continued to approach writing with deliberation, appreciating the importance of precision, reflection, and control. The tool may have disappeared, but its legacy endured in human behavior, artistic technique, and scholarly culture. Moreover, sand shaped perception. A carefully sanded manuscript or letter conveyed diligence, care, and refinement. Smudged work implied haste or inattention. These subtle signals reinforced social norms, teaching individuals to align personal habits with cultural expectations of meticulousness and mindfulness, and beyond etiquette. Sand influenced cognitive habits. The repetitive, deliberate motions of sprinkling, brushing, and weighting reinforced attention, patience, and focus. Apprentices internalized these lessons early, shaping their approach to work, study, and life. In that sense, sand was both material and teacher, a tiny, unassuming instrument of intellectual formation. Even in preservation, sand left its mark. Historians and restorers can detect faint traces, allowing them to reconstruct workflows and practices. By studying these grains, modern readers gain insight into the rhythms, habits, and care of Renaissance scribes and artists. It's a tactile connection across centuries, a quiet reminder that every manuscript is both object and experience, shaped by human hands and subtle rituals. And finally, there's the symbolic resonance. Sand embodies patience, care, and the passage of time. Each grain ensured permanence in an impermanent world. Its influence reminds us that even small, humble materials can have profound, lasting effects, shaping not only objects, but human habits, intellectual culture, and the aesthetic standards of entire eras.